Welcome to Better Bedtime Chronicles. You're listening to Nicole
and Bridget. Together we have 15 years experience working directly with families struggling with sleep challenges.
We share stories, advice, and deep dives into all things sleep. Let's go.
Hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
It's very good. How are you?
I'm great.
We got to be together last night.
Yeah.
Yes.
We tend to record these in the morning after we spend an evening together.
I didn't notice that, but you're right. Yeah.
Tell the world what we did.
We did something that probably doesn't seem like a big deal, but it feels super productive as we got together and wrapped prezzies with 3 friends and like the 3 of us. And we got through all of our special wrapping and it was real. I feel like productive and we still have time before the holidays. So that's nice.
It's kind of nice to make like an event out of something that's normally tedious, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So instead of just like kind of slogging away at it, we had drinks and chatted and
it was nice.
Chocolates. Had fun.
Reed's chocolates, all the good stuff. So that was very nice. And yeah, we're back today to talk about what I think is a really fun age. The 6 to 8 months. It's exciting because you finally can get some structure in your sleep and what your days might look like. Yeah, but there's still a wide range of normal. So we'll talk all about that today.
Yeah, and I feel like in that 6 to 8 month range, you're gradually moving towards the 2-nap sleep schedule, which is my most favorite sleep schedule. So that's coming up next podcast. But for today, we're kind of hovering in and around 3-ish naps.
Because if you're like at that 6-month-ish mark, you're likely on a 3-nap schedule. So we'll talk about leaning into 2 naps, which can happen anywhere between that 6 and 8 months. So there's many 7-month-olds who still have 3 naps a day. That's why we love a baby-led and following their cues before we transition. But usually what we start to see at 6, 7, 8 months in that realm is like increased stamina. They have more energy between their sleep, so longer wake windows and the capacity to have lengthier naps. But if you're listening to this and you're in that age group and you're like, my baby always takes short naps, that's where it's nice to get curious about things like how are they falling asleep? Is there anything in their sleep environment that could be pulling them from sleep too soon? Which is why we think about room temperature, white noise, is it good and dark, or even like other factors where they fed recently enough before that nap so they're not waking hungry. So like those are the things we can look at and control and take a deeper dive and what we can change.
Yeah, so I think, what you're saying is it's normal for naps to be short still at 6 months. Certainly that happens. But we are then at the stage where we can actually kind of make some changes to improve nap length. Ideally, a 3-nap schedule looks like a long first nap, a long second nap. When I say long, I mean like an hour to 2 hours, an hour and a half, something like that. And then that third nap tends to be a little cat nap just to get through till bedtime. And that's kind of like the schedule that we aim to see, we hope to see somewhere around 6 months of age.
Yeah.
But of course, many families come to us and say, we're still doing chronically short naps, and you can't transition to a 2-nap sleep schedule if you're on chronically short naps. That doesn't tend to work. We tend to want to keep that third one because otherwise babes get overtired at that age.
Yeah, and that's true. And if you're hearing this, I'm thinking there's no way they can make it that stretch throughout the day with only 2 naps, or maybe that opportunity is to lengthen that nap first and work on those other factors we talked about. So that way you can have good stretches of naps to hopefully carry you through the day. Like always, setting good expectations right out the gate is your best friend, not only with sleep, but like motherhood in general. I feel like, or parenthood, just making sure you have reasonable expectations. So it isn't unusual for a baby in that 6 to 8 month range to have some shorter naps, and your baby's temperament is likely a good indicator of how rested they are or if they need more sleep. But again, just getting curious about those factors around their nap or their sleep space to make sure you're setting up a space that's conducive for good quality sleep and there's nothing there that could rock them out of it. Now, if they do wake up after what we'd consider a long nap is, over an hour, but if they wake up before that 1 hour, I'd take a minute, just hold a second and see, are they just kind of fussing around? They've kind of come through a sleep cycle and they might go back to sleep with your intervention or without it. It's always worth a try. The only thing we always say is, like, if your baby has slept for a stretch of time, let's say 42 minutes, I'm sure you can set your watch to it, then you wouldn't like let them cry it out and like really force a long crib nap just because they might have the stamina to really go on for quite some time. But instead, if you hear them awake after a shorter nap and you are able to just keep an eye and they're not, too escalated, you could give them a few minutes. Or on the flip side, you could go in and try to lull them back into sleep, because even though, of course, with the clients that we see, we're working on little ones falling asleep on their own, in the heat of that moment when a nap is underway, it's better to preserve a nap in progress than worry about the independent sleep piece.
For sure. Yeah. Especially, by that stage, there is a lot of value in having kind of like longer, chunkier naps, right? Like we do tend to see younger babies cope quite well with short naps, but as babies age, they do tend to require just kind of like more condensed sleep for their overall well-being, their mood, all of those things.
Yeah, they need that nice, long, restorative sleep, consolidated sleep. It's what we all hope for. And at that age and stage, it's reasonable to hope for that, not only with naps being lengthier, but with the night sleep being much more solid as well. I can probably count on one hand how many babies I've seen since 2015 who only have short naps. Like it does happen, of course, there's a wide range of what's normal. But if a little one is having shorter naps and you've done everything, like don't feel like it's a reflection of you or anything. There's just different, things for different babies. Everyone has a different outcome. But overall, I would say that most will have lengthier naps. And then when they're adjusting to 2 naps, you might still see some days, just as you were saying, where there's 2 naps and you're left with this terribly awkward afternoon pocket that's like much too long to get to dinner time or to bedtime. And so you offer that third nap. And like any nap transition, you might have a day with 2 naps, a day with 2 naps, a day with 3 naps. And then next thing you know is a day with 2 naps, which is why we love a baby-led schedule. And so based on when your baby wakes in the morning, how long were their previous naps, like what were their activities like that day, were they in swim and they're wiped, like that might dictate how your naps play out. So as always, just making sure you're offering enough opportunity for sleep during the day.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we chat now about what kind of signs we would see that our baby would be ready to transition from 3 to 2?
Okay, so usually pretty clear cut. So what's deceiving is they often happily go down for that morning nap and they're tired. And so it's like, well, there's no way they can wait later because they're clearly wiped at that first nap of the day still. But what we usually see as an indicator would be really resisting another sleep. So it could be that nap, but it's likely the last nap or 2 of the day, or resisting bedtime a bit. And sometimes if you're unlucky, you have all of these things. They're awake for a length in the night. So it's like thinking about that 24-hour period. How many hours of sleep and when is your baby getting? And if they're having too much daytime sleep or too frequent of sleep during the day, it takes off that sleep pressure. And then in the middle of the night, they might have a good wake period, like a longer wake period. It could be 2 hours, it could be 1 hour. But either way, not what we're hoping to have is a lengthy night waking. So we start to get curious about how much sleep are they getting and should we shift that? So if you're noticing your otherwise lovely sleeping baby is resisting their nap or their bedtime, it doesn't have to be crying. Maybe it's crying, maybe they're babying around in the crib. And then otherwise they are up in the night for a little bit. If any of those things are happening, not once, but like a good 4 days a week for, I'd say, a good week or 2, then it's likely time. And they're in this age group because, as you know, things like teething, learning a new skill, or just having an off day can also show up in sleep this way. And it can be tempting to take the leap, make that jump into a 2 nap schedule, but maybe there's another explanation there. We don't want to jump too soon, which is why we say you want to see it 4 or 5 days a week for a good week or 2. And then once you've noticed that's happening, it's time to take the leap.
How many times have you had an email from a client like, yesterday was terrible, everything went wrong, I don't know, maybe it's time to switch, maybe it's time to do this, and they're like really jumping the gun. And I always just say, dial it back, let's give it a few days, because you're exactly right. Like there are many disruptors to sleep that have nothing to do with schedule, and those will kind of resolve themselves after a few days, whereas a schedule issue will continue over weeks. So there is value in just like taking a pause before you jump to conclusions.
Isn't that like my whole life? I feel like I could do better with that. Chill out and wait before you jump to conclusions. That's my best type of exercise is jumping to conclusions. It reminds me of like when the toddlers are coming out of a crib too, because there'll be one bad night or one night where they try to come out and then next thing you know, they've ordered new furniture. They're pulling them out. And then that's like, as we know, we hear the fallout from that. It's just terrible. So just waiting and seeing.
Just wait and see. That's great advice. You're talking about something interesting here, and I want to tell an anecdote about my own stuff. So My second kid was such a easy baby. She's one of those easy babies. And so she was kind of like she'd sleep when I tell her to sleep. And, it was a very different experience from my first. But what was interesting is I had her on a 3 nap schedule so long. I could not move her because she was so content. She was doing kind of what I wanted her to do when I wanted her to do it. But what happened is her naps were just chronically short. Everything else was great. She was happy. She was going down easy. I couldn't get those naps to lengthen, and I couldn't figure it out because, she fell asleep within 5 minutes of putting her down. So I was like, she must be tired. But it wasn't. It was just that she was flexible. And those flexible babies, they sometimes don't give you the signs and the cues that I certainly saw with my first, that it's time to switch, right? And so time was passing. She was almost 8 months old. She was still having 3 short naps a day. And I was like, something's weird here. So I just moved her to the new schedule, having seen none of the signs except for those short naps. And it worked like a dream. Like within 2 days, she was having 2 long naps a day. And I was like, oh my gosh, the sleep consultant in me couldn't even figure this out. So I just want to let you know that there are some babies out there who aren't necessarily going to give you those cues, but you may be struggling with something like a short nap, or you may just know developmentally that they're ready for longer awake times and that they can make this transition whether or not they're displaying the signs that they need to. So I think that's always a good time to check in too, is if they start nearing 8 months of age, they're happy, easy babies, it's all working well, but you see maybe things could still be a bit better. That's a good time to start exploring that as well.
Yeah, I like that. And 8 months would be the sort of higher end, I think.
Yes.
Just depending on the baby, of course, they're also different. But you brought up something important too, I think, is even someone who's so well read on sleep, we've read all the things, we do this for work.
Yeah.
You still in your own home can just get so I don't know. We're just blinded, and I've certainly, even in this role, have leaned on colleagues to be like, tell me what I'm missing. I'm missing something. Take a look here and see.
I've said that to you probably 4 times in the last 2 years with my youngest, right? Because you can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and that's a normal thing. That's why people like us are out there. But so don't feel dismayed if you're like, oh my God, I've read all the things, I've done all the programs or whatever it is.
Sometimes you need fresh eyes.
Sometimes you need just a fresh perspective on it too. So, and on that note too, so let's say you're in the weeds here and you're trying to navigate this whole transition with going down to 2 naps. So not only be flexible with the day and take each nap as a new chance to sort of stretch that wake window out a little bit. That's something I want to talk about just for a sec, is how do we do that? Because you're often, one of our problems is we're left with this terrible timing and we don't know what to do. And we certainly couldn't make it to bedtime. And so the 2 things I think worth discussing is how to lengthen a wake window in a easier, kinder way, but still push it a bit. And the other is what's our minimal bedtime? Because when you're left with this stretch, then it can be well, when can bedtime be? When is too early? When is too late? And so for stretching wake windows out, we like to just change the scenery. Fresh air is always a good friend with that. If you can, even in the winter, no such thing as bad weather, just, wrap them up, get everyone dressed up, having some fresh air, doing things like offering protein-rich food or a switch up of activities, even playing in a bit of water, let's say in the sink or something like that, to keep them busy. And then if you notice a cue that you would typically act on and put them down, so maybe they've rubbed their eyes, they've let out a yawn, and it's around when they would typically nap, we'd ask that you wait even 15 minutes or 20 minutes by doing some of these things to try to stretch out that wake window, which is, on one hand, it's going to give us, hopefully push our naps into the day more so that the naps are spread out in a way that is helpful for bedtime. But on the other hand, if we increase sleep pressure, it's a fine line not to get overtired, but we want them to be good and tired enough to take a lengthy nap. So it's really coming from 2 ways.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point, is trying to recognize those sleep cues and then move past them. That's a bit of a struggle, right? Parents are so used to, and we really encourage parents to stick to those cues. But when you are in a nap transition, there sometimes is value in just stretching them little bits. So when Bridget says, 10, 15 minutes a day, that's ideal. That's how they can make it and get that wake window stretched. And it's usually 2, 3 days. Well, they maybe get a little bit more tired around that time, and then they're through it. They figure it out. The habit of falling asleep at, exactly 2 hours has shifted, and now they're used to the longer awake time. And they fall into that pattern pretty quickly. But yeah, it's just a few days.
Yeah, they surprise us. And which is why it's so important, I think, to wait and just hold a sec to make sure the timing's right to do it before you leap in after one tricky day. And so when we think about going to a 2-nap schedule, of course, this would depend on your little one's morning wake time and what your commitments are in terms of getting out the door and things like that. But we usually see somewhere around 9:30 for that first nap, and then again around 1:32 for that second nap. And when it's in progress, we try to keep it as long as we can to get through to the end of the day. And so that next piece was about when's too early to start bedtime routine.
Yeah.
I
get asked that a lot.
Yeah, I get asked this too. I would say like 6. The absolute,
no earlier than 6.
Yeah, like if you have to pop them in the bath at like 5:50, if you had to because they're absolutely beside themselves, okay. But I usually draw that line around 6.
Yeah, that's exactly what I suggest too. And I think another key point I always share with families is I like to stretch kids in the middle of the day more than I'd like to stretch them at bedtime. So if you're like doing the nap math and realizing that your next nap is going to end or start rather a little early and therefore end early and make like a huge gap before bed, I would encourage that family to push that nap a little later because kids are much more flexible and have a lot more capacity for stretching in between their 2 naps rather than right before bed. Right before bed, if we stretch them too far, you're going to be up all night with them. So we might as well, take the risk for a second nap rather than take the risk for nighttime sleep.
Yeah.
So that's always something I encourage.
That's a good point too. And aside from sleep, if you have just that overtired pocket in the afternoon, that kind of witching hour, it makes your 4 to 6 p.m. just a nightmare.
Exactly.
Right? And you have they're all fussing and crying and whining and nobody's happy. And in those moments, I always would like visualize like how it's going to feel when everyone's asleep in an hour or two and try to like mentally get there because in the moment it feels like it can gobble you up.
That's always the hardest time of my day is that like dinner, bedtime, everyone's tired, everyone's max capacity. The kids have been, regulating all day at school. So they've lost that, skill set for home.
Yeah.
And that's a tiring part of the day. So the best, all we can do to maximize for success during that time is ideal.
I think so too. Like having that predictable routine, making sure they have, dinner at a good time and then can confidently put them to bed. This was something I read years ago. I forget who wrote this, but it was about like basically putting your kids to bed with authority and affection. And then, like the authority can sound so scary. Like, oh, am I being mean? But like, especially they're exhausted. They might not seek bed or they might in fact resist bed. But for you to confidently, as a parent, follow through with it and make it happen because they need it as they need water, food, whatever, all the things they need, milk, clean clothes, a clean body, like they need sleep. So for you to like make it happen and go for it is, I think, a really good thing to do as a parent. Obviously, I'm a little biased about that. But
yeah, for sure. I think you'll hear parents say something like, oh, I could never do that. That would never work in my home. And in those moments, I'm like, well, like you can do it. Like you're the parent, you can make this choice, right? And you can support your kid in this way. For some reason, sleep sometimes falls outside of the realm of like the basic needs that we offer our children, right? Like you would never allow your children not to eat for a whole day, right?
That's
so
that's a good point.
Allow them to miss really important sleep.
Do you think any of it probably, but do you think any of it comes from this like shame around being like, if that's setting this firm boundary and how you shouldn't let them, shed a tear or be fussy around their sleep and then it ends up with no sleep, and how is that better? It reminds me of this pediatrician we saw. This was many years ago. My oldest was 1. He's now 12. And we went to a pediatrician. And it's funny because my son, you could tell he was a bottle baby. He just looked like all he drank were bottles and not ate food. He was 12 months. And we went to this for a follow-up to this ped in Kitchener. And he's like, how many bottles does he have a day? And we're like 4, whatever it was. Right. I forget what it was. And he's like, you need to cut that down by like 50% straight away and he'll eat food better. And my husband said, he's not going to let us do that. We can't do that. And he goes, be a parent.
Oh, God.
And we're like, he's so hardcore. Rude. I know. We're like, oh, I think this gentleman has 4 kids from what I've been told. But I'm like, we left being like hurt feelings.
Sure.
Okay? But then we like mulled it over and we're like, yeah, be a parent, be the, the bad guy or the whatever. And sometimes it's hard to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
But what do you know? We did it and he started eating solids better, like we listened to what he said.
Sure.
And I think sleep can be that way too. And so especially if you're in this, and it's seemingly always a transition in front of you, because we've talked about newborn sleep, talked about that tricky 4-month group. Now we're into the 6 to 8 month, and it's like as soon as you finally get your footing, all of a sudden we're like, oh, well, now you have to change this. But it really does boil down to those same few pieces of like, if it's not working so well, let's make some changes and just focusing on having like good sleep foundations and good expectations.
Yeah. And that's kind of, that 6 to 8 month thing in a nutshell. Oh, I just thought of a question like I get asked all the time, so maybe I'll ask you. What is the impact of introducing solids on sleep? Like, how do you, parents are always trying to navigate, feeding solids and sleep and what's going to happen when that all goes down.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's exactly in this age group. This is exactly the same time. So I always say to people, never try a new food straight before sleep, because you want to watch for any kind of reaction. And Nicole and I are both allergy moms. We have some pretty intense allergies in our homes, and some have outgrown, some have not. So we are definitely sticklers on make sure that you try a food long before anyone's going to bed. But I think you would expect some digestion discomfort, maybe, depending on what they're trying. And if you're when in doubt, check them out, like always, if there's something there. But people can be nervous and say, I don't want to like sleep train until solids are going well, or I don't want to start solids until sleep's going well. And sometimes those things just don't happen naturally. So I wouldn't delay starting solids due to sleep training. Certainly I would maybe like the first night or two, you keep it plain and like milk based. And if you've heard that term, food before one is just for fun, like take the pressure off your shoulders about it a bit.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't stop or delay sleep training just because we're into new foods. I would actually be curious of like, what difference would we see? Are we seeing better sleep? Or are we seeing something else happen? What do you think?
And generally, like I think often we see improved sleep because their tummies are a little more full. Breast milk in particular is very easy to digest, and so they get hungry quickly on breast milk. But solid foods take longer to digest, so sometimes they are able to sleep longer because their tummies feel full for more time. You're right, though. Sometimes it gets disrupted, especially if there's digestive issues or allergens, all those things. So. Certainly sleep and food are related, and I think it's wise to kind of keep an eye on it. But yeah, I completely agree. Like dive in, and don't worry too much, because most of the time it works out pretty nicely.
It does. It really does. And luckily, especially in our community, there's so many resources to see a nutritionist. Some are like breastfeeding specialists as well as nutritionists, which is what we love to see too, to make sure we're getting everyone covered. But even wherever you're listening, if there's likely someone in your neck of the woods too who can be helpful if you are worried about that at all.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I guess that wraps up the 6 to 8 month age group. We're heading into a big chunk of time now where the 2-nap is pretty consistent, and we'll talk about that in our next podcast.
Yes, we definitely will. And so what you would expect next is just once you get sturdy and you're on those 2 naps, you'll carry that on for quite some time. So we'll hop into the next episode where you can learn more.
Thanks for listening. Just remember, the shit is hard, but you are killing it.
To stay in touch, you can find us at betterbedtime.ca.